to order the meeting zoning for housing preservation and equity, the committee meeting tonight. Thank you very much for attending. We have a very, very important topic to discuss, and we have an excellent presenter tonight who knows the topic very, very well. So I'm very glad that you joined, because it's something that is going to really impact our community, because we have been selected as one of the pilot areas. This time, I'm going to ask for the approval of the January meeting minutes. Has everybody received it, or the members, have you received it? Can I get a motion to accept the minutes? To be able to accept the minutes, I need a motion and a second to have it accepted. So would one of the members present the motion to accept the minutes as presented? Okay, I'll table that for now and come back.
I'm a
What?
new member, but I just started being a member of this month, but I haven't received any minutes for January, so I'm not sure how that
Okay.
works.
Okay, I appreciate you.
Yes, I don't think that I didn't receive any minutes. I'm just looking, I'm just checking, but I don't think I
The
have
minutes were
minutes.
sent in the email that also has the agenda attached to it.
Okay, not, because I think I got 2 emails. I'm gonna check the other one.
No, they both should have it.
Is it as an attachment or is it in the email body?
It's an attachment. It's a Word document.
Okay, so I'm just going to give some background. So once you have it, Margaret, if you want to make the motion, just interrupt me so we can bring the speaker on. This committee has been very active in terms of addressing the zoning issue of our community. Many other areas in Brooklyn were permitted to zone to preserve a considerable amount of the housing, except for CD 17. And so this committee has been working very actively on this issue. As part of this project, the rezoning project, we looked in terms of the number of housing units that can be created by possible basement conversion, and the number was substantial. So when the state passed laws that facilitated what needs to be done, and our speaker will speak more clearly on the issue, I thought it was imperative we address it. So that's why we're going to have Howard Spatkin, I think I've got his name correct, the Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Council, speak to us this evening. But before I bring him on, Margarita, did you get their minutes?
Hello.
I'm
This is
still looking for it, actually. I'm trying to open it. I think I have them. Hang on a second. You can keep going. I'll let you know.
No, because otherwise I'm going to bring in the interest of time to bring the presenter
Yeah,
on.
just
Pass,
go forward with the meeting.
I wanted to
'Cause
pass the minute, otherwise we'll have to table it. Okay, so without, I would like to introduce to you tonight, Howard Slatkin. As I said, he's the Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Council, and he is as knowledgeable about this topic as anybody is. So thank you very much, Howard, for joining us this evening. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jael, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you all. I think what I've planned here is I have a presentation that I'll share my screen for in just a moment that covers some of the research that my organization has done on low density housing issues generally. That is the context for this, but then at the end of it, I really hone in on the basement apartment legalization issues that have been considered at the state and at the city level, and what's already happened at the state and what would have to happen next in order for there to be changes in order to authorize, to enable units to be made legal in the future. So I'll do that in just a second, but first I wanted to just do a little bit more sort of my own background and biography, so where my organization is coming from, what we do, and sort of some of my own background as well. Citizens Housing and Planning Council is a nonprofit housing and planning research organization, research and education organization. We do independent research on topics of importance to New York City's housing stock and the communities served by it. And we try to do the kind of research that's going to both help the public better understand issues and also help guide government and policymakers towards productive and helpful policies. So some of our research is sort of broad and big picture, and some of it is about the nitty-gritty details that are necessary to address to make things work. And I think some of this topic touches on some of both of those things. I also, in a previous life, I've been with CHPC for about 1.5 years now, but before that, I spent 22 years with the Department of City Planning, beginning as a community planner in their Brooklyn Borough office, and ultimately responsible for their citywide policy analysis, research, and the development of citywide initiatives. So things like citywide zoning reforms and other related issues are something that I have a lot of experience with, and so I understand a lot of the technical details and how they relate to community issues. So what I'm going to present, and actually I'm going to ask if anyone has their mic on, if they could just mute their mic so I can avoid the feedback. What I'm going to present is broad. It's not about CB17, although I will try to locate CB17 within this, and then we'll have plenty of time afterwards, I hope, for questions and discussion about any issues that you have particular questions about, or how some of these things might apply within your community. So let me see how quickly I can mobilize to share my screen and the presentation I have for this evening. Just a moment. Okay, let me. Can people see the presentation right now?
Not really.
It's currently a
customizing
white
your-
screen.
I see a white screen.
Okay, let me work on that. Give me a moment. Let me see if I can share in a different way. Just a moment. Now, can you see?
Yeah, we see
What's
some
that?
taxis in a street.
Oh, well, that's not it. Let me try one more time. I might have to try to do this from a different piece of software, so bear with me for a moment. I apologize. JL, I don't know if you you can return to your other portion of the agenda if you want, and I'll make sure that my screen share is
great.
working.
Margaret,
Okay, well, I found the meeting minutes.
okay, would you kindly make a motion?
Sure,
That's it.
I make a motion to approve the minutes from January.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Bree DaCosta seconds the motion.
Thank you. All in favor? All in
Aye.
favor of accepting the minutes? Say aye, please. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? There being none, any abstentions? So the minutes have been accepted as presented. Thank you very much. Hopefully by the end of June, the June meeting, we'll have the remaining minutes, and so we'll get this year wrapped up. So thank you very, very much. As you may know by now, not all the Howard, I'm just going to speak until you're ready, so please interrupt me. So not all the areas of Brooklyn was selected. CB17 was one, which is, I think, a very good thing as a pilot program to explore this, because we are looking at ways to be able to tell the city, let the city know that there are other ways to develop housing instead of destroying the homes that we have in our community. Because as you know, when homes are destroyed, it represents a loss for the future generation as well. Any comments, any observations while we wait for Howard on the issue?
I have a comment. I'm always for providing more housing. My name's David Schaefer. I'm here with Senator Persaud's office. My big concern is always safety with basement apartments. You know, I think that people have the ability to gain income, which especially for seniors who are homeowners, that can like completely change their game. But again, those units have to be safe for the tenants.
Absolutely. So I think we will find, hopefully find that embedded in all of this would be provisions that the building code would need to address the issue to make sure that if this goes forward, that it's done in a manner that does not jeopardize lives. We all know some years ago, there was a loss of life, I think in Sandy or some other storm, I don't quite recall. So absolutely, safety is an overriding concern. I should have brought up the numbers, but the numbers were very staggering. When we had a consultant who actually did an analysis last year to see how many additional housing units could materialize from a basement conversion program, and the number was very impressive. Because if you think of the apartment buildings going up, the number of housing units that generates compared to permitting homeowners to, if safely, to convert their basements to livable space, that number was, off the top of my head, over 5,000 units. So it's really, it really does offer the opportunity to substantially increase the housing stock in Community Board 17 if we're able to move forward with it. I'm sure we'll learn tonight as to how long the pilot program is going to last, and what are the measures that are going to be in place and how it's going to be done. We know there was one which was undertaken some time ago in, I think it was East New York.
East New York, yes.
Yeah. To me, I wasn't surprised it didn't. I mean, if you're gonna start up a project by looking at buildings that need almost $250,000 to convert a basement unit to a livable space, to me that's going to be an absolute failure. So I wasn't surprised, but I'm hoping that as the pilot program proceeds, it'll be very clear, hopefully very clear, that probably $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, which is recoverable over in a rental income, would be a much better measure to start to implement the program, rather than looking for at spaces that would require $250,000 to have it fixed.
I had a question.
So can I interrupt for just a second, just because I would love to be able to troubleshoot. So I take it no one is able to see the screen that I'm trying to share through WebEx right now.
It's currently a white
Yes, white.
screen.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. JL, I just emailed you a copy of a PDF, and I wonder if you won't have the same technical difficulty if you were able to share.
Sure, no worries.
I apologize for the imposition.
That's okay. That's technology.
Yeah, well, it's my. I had to just download WebEx for this meeting. I hadn't used it on this machine previously, so it seems like a trial run would have been a good idea. I apologize to everyone.
Whenever I have to give a presentation, that's my biggest nightmare.
Well, welcome.
Yeah.
So,
yes.
but I can start talking about some of the things. I think it's great to know that there's specifically the issue of safety, the experience of the East New York pilot and what we learned in that pilot. I will be happy to touch on those things. And I think, you know, and also in the interest of time, if we end up able to see the presentation, I'll be able to walk through it. But I have a whole battery of information that summarizes some other analysis that we've done, and perhaps what I can do with that is just sort of summarize some of it. And I think, you know, it's, as I said, background for the issue of basement apartments and how we consider how CHPC looks at housing need, and particularly in housing need in low density districts. So maybe I'll just start talking through that and the research that we've done. It's better and more entertaining when I have all the visuals to go with it, but I can explain you know, what this is. So there's a section I have on housing issues, our research on housing issues in low density neighborhoods and what people are experiencing, which I'm sure you know in a much more firsthand way than anything that I'm going to present in terms of data. But we did some surveying and polling of residents of low density districts to find out what people are experiencing. Then I'll talk about the basement apartment issue as it exists today, and what the challenges of the current regulatory environment are. And finally, what the state legislation has done and what further city legislation could do to enable legalization of basement apartments. So first off, CHPC has a research initiative that we call Housing Fits All. It's sort of, instead of one size fits all, it's that our housing has to not be one size fits all. Our housing has to, oh, look at that. Do we have, you're able to share your screen much better than I am. Thank you. There we go. So if you'll, I guess you're advancing the slides. If you go to the next slide, this is our initiative, Housing Fits All. We like to frame some of these issues. You know, there are a lot of debates about how much housing should be provided, where, what's the fair amount of housing that any neighborhood should be contributing. Those are difficult questions, but we decided to, instead of framing it as how much housing should low density communities and neighborhoods around the city be providing for everyone else, we want to look at it from the experience of residents in these communities and how well is housing in the neighborhoods already meeting their needs or not meeting their needs. And the objective of our work is to do more to empower people to make their housing fit their needs, rather than having to go and find different housing every time your circumstances change. And this happens to us a lot. You should be able to make your home fit your needs as flexibly as possible. And that's the way we're going to sort of help preserve the stability and the meet the housing needs that a wide range of residents have. Next, thank you. So we started by polling. We did a survey of 805 residents of low density districts. We literally came up with this geography that you see on your screen and commissioned someone to, professionals, poller to do a survey of residents of R1 through R5 districts to ask them questions about how well their housing is or isn't meeting their needs. And we found several things. Next slide, please. The first thing that we wanted to do is table set here, but you know, these are the broad conclusions that we have. A lot of people who don't live in low density districts don't understand the diversity that exists in them and the changes that have been going on in many low density districts that in many cases have led to even broader population diversity than has existed before. Every neighborhood has had different patterns and shifts going on in them, but as a whole, low density districts have become significantly more diverse. But we found a lot of evidence that the housing that's available doesn't fit everyone's needs. And part of the reason is that people's housing needs change frequently because of life events, things that are not choices that people make, but situations that they face. We also found that residents of low density districts felt very insecure, and I'll talk a little bit about this more. So this is the demographic changes that have gone on in low density districts between 2000 and 2020. Actually, you can flick back forward, and I'll jump forward because we'll get to each of these other conclusions. But I do want to note the last finding, which is that one thing that did jump out of our survey is that the use of basements and cellars for living space or for rental space was disproportionately important to Black homeowners compared to all other homeowners in our survey. And I'll give you some more detail on that. Low density districts between the year 2000 and the year 2020 went from being more white non-Hispanic to less white non-Hispanic than the rest of New York City. The biggest drivers of this were growth in the Asian and Hispanic populations, which grew citywide from 2000 to 2020. There was a modest decline in the proportion of the population of low density districts that is Black or African American from 23 to 20%, but an even sharper decline in low density districts of the white proportion of the population. We present this just as a big picture framing to show that the populations that live in these neighborhoods can't be easily pigeonholed. There's a wide variety of needs and a wide variety of communities that make their homes in low density neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And the housing in low density areas is also diverse. There are, yes, small homes, single family homes, 2-family homes, but a large share of the housing is actually in multifamily buildings. 41% of it is in multifamily buildings, and there's more housing in buildings with 10 or more units than there is in single family homes. That said, there are a diversity of housing types, and there are lots of ways that people live. This is where homeownership is most common in New York City, but still a majority of residents in low density zoning districts rent rather than own their homes. And that's true of people in every demographic. We found that in our poll, 40% of the seniors who responded to our poll, people age 60 or over in our poll, rent their homes rather than own them. There are a lot of people who own their homes, but there are also a lot of people who rent, and there's a relationship between those two. Next slide, please. This is a way that we like to look at CHPC. We like to look at how people are living in their homes. There are lots of different living configurations that people have. Everything in this chart you'll see from the left side, which is single adults living alone, to couples or couples with children, single adults with children, related adults living together. They could be other family relations, and then finally unrelated adults living together. Different kinds of living arrangements that may exist where people may have a renter or a boarder or a family friend, but not a relative living together. And what you can see is that there's if you go back for just 1 second, there's something that shows up in low density districts. If you go back 1 slide for just 1 second. In low density districts, there are a limited number of, a much smaller percentage of the population are single adults living alone. In part, that's a reflection of the kind of housing that exists. There tend to be small homes, but homes in their entirety and not as many apartments as there are in the rest of the city. And you see a larger proportion of unrelated adults living together in low density districts than you see in the rest of the city. That may be a choice, that may be their desire, but it also could be people who would live as single adults if they could find a place to live that was matched, where they only had the right amount of space for an individual to live. But those housing options are uncommon in many low density districts. And as a result, we see a lot of different living configurations. Next slide, please. We also asked people, why did they move to their current home? And sorry if the print is a little bit small here, but one of the things that jumped out is that people said that the most common reason people gave for why they moved to their current home was that there was a change in the composition of their household. Who's living with them? That could be getting married. That could be getting divorced or separated. That could be having a child. That could be having a child who's grown up and left the home. But these are the changes that we often don't control. This is life happening to us. And that's one of the most common reasons that people have to move. It was roughly twice as common in our survey as people saying they moved to be closer to a job or to be closer to family. It's just a reminder that people's housing needs change and they have to find ways to adapt with that. Next slide, please. And these are just some of the stories that that our poll respondents told us. You know, everyone has a different set of circumstances. Life is unpredictable. Families are complicated. All sorts of things happen in people's lives, and they have to adjust their housing. But many times, and we'll get to this, I'll get to this a little bit more, many times it's difficult to do that, and sometimes it's because the law makes it difficult. Next slide, please. What are the implications if you can't find another home in your neighborhood? Well, when we polled people, they told us 90% of people, 89% said that it was somewhat or very difficult to find a home in the neighborhood that met their needs. It's not like they could find another place if they needed one easily at some point in the future. And a third of our respondents said that they had a family member or a friend move out of the neighborhood in the last 5 years, whether it was moving out of the city, moving out of the region, or just moving out of the neighborhood, because they couldn't find a home that met their needs in that neighborhood. So many communities, particularly low density communities, are ethnic communities, are cultural communities. These are groups of people who move together with people from their home country, with people from their lives, their family, and they rely on the ability to find homes near one another in order to build and sustain community. And the harder it is to find housing in neighborhoods, the more difficult it is to sustain that kind of community. Next slide, please. We were a bit surprised by this. We asked people whether they were worried about that rising costs of owning or renting their home would prevent them from staying in their home as long as they wanted to. And we certainly expected that renters would be concerned about this. We had 82% of renters told us that, but 2/3 of owners said the same thing, said that they were worried about the cost of owning or renting their home. Tenants and owners, and this is just in low density neighborhoods, both reported feeling really insecure in their ability to stay as long as they would like in their homes. And of course, we know from the previous item that they are very skeptical about their ability to find a different home in their community. And we also looked at how much new housing has been built. This question of how much new housing has been made available, what we found is that low density districts, R1 through R5 districts, cover 71% of the city's residential land. 34%, about a third of the city's housing is in these districts, but only 9% of new housing since 2010 is in these districts. What does that mean? Well, that means that the housing shortage, the housing crisis, is more intense in low density neighborhoods. These are the places where less new housing is coming online and fewer new choices are available. So that pressure cooker, that housing pressure that's being felt by people in so many neighborhoods has very, very few outlets in low density neighborhoods. Next slide. And we tried to benchmark this. Well, okay, we know that there's not a lot of housing being built in low density districts. We looked at, on a per capita basis, how many new housing units are being created per existing resident, right? That's sort of like a percentage growth measure. We found that low density districts, which appear at the top of this chart, are adding less housing than any comparison we could draw. We looked at other US cities. You can see in this list, everyone from Austin building the most housing to Detroit building the least housing. Detroit, a city which is a deeply economically troubled city, a shrinking city with fewer people every decade. A shrinking city is building more housing on a proportional basis than our low density neighborhoods. Our low density neighborhoods are producing enough housing to support a shrinking city, but they're growing. So that's a major, major affordability challenge. Next slide. And in the region, we talk a lot about how other parts of the metropolitan area don't add enough housing. New York City is better at adding housing than most of the suburban counties, but low density districts are, again, on a proportional basis, building less housing than Long Island. So there's a lot of challenges for people who are feeling housing, that they can't find housing today and that they don't have enough options. So next slide, please. What do you do when you can't find a different home? You look to modify your own home. We asked people about the kinds of changes they might want to make to their own homes in our poll, and we found out a few different things that tell us a bit about this. We found that in about a third of the homes where unrelated adults were living together, basements or cellars were used for living space. So it seems like that's an important potential way to have somebody else sharing space, renting space within your home, but not crowding together in the same personal space. We found that people with children under 25, 38% of owners with children under 25 would like to renovate or expand their homes in a way that better meets their needs. We found that adding living space was an interest for 40% of owners. And that was highest among the Latino and Asian respondents to our poll. Those are also the two population groups that citywide are growing and have been growing most rapidly in low density neighborhoods as well. So the need to add living space occurs in the home and occurs outside the home as well. And finally, older people and adults living alone, many of whom are older adults, expressed significant concerns that they might not be able to stay in their homes because they are not accessible because of a physical disability they have today or may have to deal with in the future. That the need for accessibility in their home is a concern for them. Next slide. As I mentioned in the beginning, we found that rental income and the use of basement space for living space were disproportionately important to Black homeowners compared to all homeowners in our survey. 3 times more Black homeowners indicated that they rely on renting out 1 or more units in their home for income. 25% of the Black homeowners responding to our survey is compared to 9% of all other homeowners in low density areas. And finally, almost half of Black homeowners reported that they use their basement or cellar for living space. That could be their own living space, or it could be living space that they rent out. That is more than twice the rate for other respondents to our poll. So we thought this highlighted some significant equity considerations and the importance of basement apartments. Well, why don't people modify their homes? We asked them this question too. More than half said it's too costly. And almost half said that regulations are the primary difficulty. Now, you have to have tried in order to have found that the regulations are the primary difficulty. But the fact that it was reported by such a high percentage of respondents tells us that there's really an issue there. And why could regulations be a big obstacle to adapting or renovating or expanding your home? Well, most people's homes were built before the regulations that exist today went into effect, and so they don't fit very well. More than 3/4 of the residences in low density districts were built before the 1961 zoning resolution was adopted. And 90% of them were built before new zoning regulations went into effect in 1989 for many low density districts. So there's often one or more ways that your house doesn't comply with the requirements, and it's difficult to enlarge if your house already doesn't comply with the existing zoning requirements. Sometimes the consequences of regulations not fitting can be truly heartbreaking. This is a story that's very personal to my colleagues at CHBC. This is Mrs. Velez, who we met through our work in the Bronx, 93 years old as of this news article from a few years ago, had purchased her home, been renting out her basement for decades. She found out when a building inspector visited that the unit was not legal. She hadn't known this before she acquired the home. It looks perfectly reasonable. It's a walk-in at-grade unit. It may be inches below the curb, but it is, by all appearances, an ordinary ground floor apartment. But no, it's an illegal basement apartment under regulations. Mrs. Velez has a tenant who lives there, who is a retired public servant, who does errands for her, who helps her with getting to medical appointments and other things, pays $800 a month in rent for an apartment, which helps supplement her Social Security income and helps her afford her home. But she has no way to make that unit legal. To other examples, but this is a real serious problem with the regulations that exist, and I'll talk about the East New York experience that we've had and how those things are playing out. The kinds of additional housing that exist in low density neighborhoods are often difficult to create. 2 and 3 family homes. I put down here ADUs. Now that is a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and rather than catalog all of it, it just means an additional apartment in a small home. It could be a basement apartment. It could be an apartment that's attached to the existing building. And in some instances, it could be an apartment that's detached. Those are all things that are not permitted in low density neighborhoods, but in many cases do exist within neighborhoods today. There are also small apartment buildings. I know that in CB17, you are one of the districts that has multifamily low density zoning. So in theory, small apartment buildings can be built, but a lot of times the regulations make it extremely difficult for those to be built even on a site that's large enough. And finally, there is an inability often to build mixed use buildings on commercial corridors. But I want to focus back on basements and ADUs for the next segment here. So perhaps you can move on to the next slide. Okay, basement apartments. Next slide. The basement apartment issue really has to be understood as part of our housing shortage. We have a housing shortage because New York City's population has grown by over 1.5 million people since 1980. But since 1980, we've been building housing at about half the rate that we did in the 4 decades leading up to 1980. We see this all playing out in high housing prices, in 100,000 people in our emergency shelter system for homelessness. We talk about all the strains that exist on homeowners, particularly in communities of color in the boroughs. And part of this is that we have thousands of people living in improvised spaces, non-legal spaces, especially in basement apartments around the city. Next slide. Can you, thank you. So basement apartments can provide lower cost homes than the other kinds of homes that are available in a neighborhood for people who can't access the other kinds of housing in a neighborhood. They can provide smaller homes. They're usually smaller than the other kinds of homes or buildings or apartments available in a neighborhood. They can be flexible living space connected to or disconnected from the rest of the home that work very well for lots of different family arrangements, which also change over time. And they can, of course, provide important additional rental income for homeowners, particularly homeowners who are concerned about being able to make their monthly payments. Next slide. There are a lot of, we talk about basement apartments. There are many legal basement apartments. They were created in zoning districts where they're allowed under code provisions that they comply with. But there are many that are not legal for one or more reasons because of one or more city or state regulations and can't be made legal today. What happens then? Well, owners can't file permits. If they want to bring them up to code and safety standards, they can't file for a permit because it's not allowed. And what happens with tenants? Tenants desperately don't want these units to often to be discovered because of the risk that they could be put out on the street and asked to sort of step in line behind 100,000 other people who are already in temporary shelter in New York City. So the idea that there's a lot of strain on both tenants and homeowners over basement apartments is a really important thing. And of course, flood risk, we talked about safety. I'll talk about how we remedy it, but flood risk has really highlighted the importance of making basement apartments in particular safe. We all know from Hurricane Ida, from Tropical Storm Ida, how tragic the consequences of this can be. When you can't upgrade a unit under the law, we have thousands of people living in potentially unsafe conditions, which is a really needs to be seen as an emergency that we need to deal with. Next slide. There are ways to make basement and cellar units safer. We at CHPC put together a report just a couple of years ago called An Action Plan for Basement Flood Safety and Stormwater Equity. These are strategies that can be used to make every unit as safe as it can be and to make improvements in neighborhoods that are going to help reduce flood risk and improve safety. But none of these things are really possible if units can't be legalized, if no one will let us know where units are and they can't get permission in order get permission to make improvements to the units. Next slide. So when basement apartments are illegal, there are really two options. We leave people, as we have for many, many years, living in potentially unsafe conditions, or put them out on the street by vacating the unit. Those are not good options, and there's a reason why. we're looking for better approaches. The only approach that is going to be able to maximize the amount of safe housing that we can have and to help eliminate the unsafe housing that we have is to create a pathway so that basement apartments can be made safe if and only if made legal, if and only if they are brought up to safety standards. And that is something that does not exist in most cases today. So what do we do about this? Next slide. CHBC is a member of the BASE coalition, the Basement Apartments Safe for Everyone campaign. This is a group of community-based organizations and represented. There's us, a citywide housing policy organization, other organizations like the Pratt Center for Community Development that are interested in expanding the range of housing options available to renters, as well as helping homeowners be able to afford their homes. The coalition has been promoting changes to regulations at both the state and city level that can enable basement legalization. And I'll get to that in just a moment now. Next slide. We were the evaluator for the East New York basement apartment legalization pilot program. And I, in this little clip, I was appearing on New York One to talk about the report that we released last year, the interim report on the East New York pilot program. So what did we learn from that project, which aimed to find ways to legalize basement apartments in East New York, Brooklyn? Next slide. In CB5, we found that I will say that the basement apartment legalization pilot was not a success at achieving the legalization of a significant number of units. As a matter of fact, only one is close to that point, and one additional one is in the process. The reason that there's so few is that we found that a web of state and city regulations made it impossible. Whether it was zoning regulations, provisions of building code, provisions of the state multiple dwelling law that made it either outright impossible or just prohibitively expensive. What's an example of this? If your ceiling heights in your basement were just inches below the 7'6" or 7 feet that were allowed for as a minimum ceiling height, if they were just a couple of inches below, the only way to deal with that, you can't raise that ceiling, you have to dig out the floor of your basement. And to excavate the floor of your basement could cost $100,000 to $200,000 easily. Could double or triple the cost of creating a lawful apartment. It just makes it prohibitively expensive. There are other examples that the state multiple dwelling law, if you have a 2-family home and you're adding an apartment to a 2-family home, you become a multiple dwelling, a 3-family home under state law. And that means things like you have to provide roof access and a parapet. Even if your home has a pitched roof, it looks like a house, it doesn't look like a tenement building. The law thinks you're a tenement building, and you have to do things to your building that only make sense if you're thinking of it as a 1929 Lower East Side tenement building. So these regulations are outdated. They're not written with the goal of making it possible and financially achievable to legalize a basement apartment. And so that's the need and the opportunity for reform that this pilot program really highlighted. Next slide, please. So these are some of the impediments that people ran into. Zoning may either prohibit 2 or 3 family homes, depending on the district you're in, or it would require you to add a parking space if you add a unit, and you may not have any parking. You may have a building that has that's built 5 feet back from the street line. There's no place to put a parking space, so you can't add a unit to your building. There may be density controls that don't just limit the size of your building, which you're not enlarging, but limit the number of units that can exist based on the size of your building. Those are controlled by zoning. There are building code provisions like ceiling height requirements, window dimensions like minimum measurements, which are going to be different if you're below grade and you want your windows to be above grade where you can gather light. You might have a wider and less tall window. Those are different requirements than the requirements in code don't take into account those needs. And in addition, if you are adding an apartment to your building, this is important. If you're modifying your home, usually you have to get, if you have to modify the certificate of occupancy for your home, you have to get a new certificate of occupancy for your entire home. You can't just get one for the portion of your home that you're modifying. And that dramatically increases the cost of that you have to go through to get an architect and drawings and filings and make sure that you remedy anything else that isn't up to code in your home. This can be prohibitive. Next slide, please. So what do we do about all that? Next slide. Can we advance the presentation, please? Is it stuck on this slide? This is really going to be the payoff. This is where I get to talk about the actual changes to the law. So let me see if I can. There we go. Thank you. Next. So what can the city and state do in order to enable the legalization of units that can be made safe? Next slide. Well, as you know, as JL mentioned in the introduction, in the state budget this year, the legislature and the governor adopted what they called a pilot program. It was a kind of a curious pilot program, but it is a set of changes that authorize the city, that give the city the ability to pass a local law that would make targeted changes to building codes and the multiple dwelling law that would allow modification of just those provisions that are making it difficult or too costly to legalize basement apartments. It wouldn't change regulations for any other kind of building or situation. It would just give the city the ability to create a program that gives relief for basement apartments. It doesn't immediately provide that relief. It requires the city to then take action, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. It doesn't affect the entire city. It only affects about 15 community districts, but one of those is Brooklyn CB17. And the program that was adopted gives 5 years for this legalization program to occur. So it kind of has a ticking clock associated with it. Now that's a bit of a concern because that isn't that much time if it includes the passage of additional legal changes and then the time that it takes individual homeowners to sort of gather up the funding and the plans and the other things that they need. So, you know, this is something that may need some kind of extension in the future in order to accommodate people. But the state legislature, after a lot of opposition and a lot of, I think, confused debate at the state level, did give a limited window for this kind of program to be started. Next slide, please. So to implement this program, the city council needs to pass a local law that would implement the legalization program. It would make give the relief from building code and multiple dwelling law provisions sort of in circumstances when they are needed. It would allow legalization of units if they meet the state safety standards that are spelled out in code with the modifications under this law. And it also attaches in order to sort of address the security of existing residents, with an acknowledgement that while work is going on in a building, it may be that it's likely that tenants may need to move out in order for the work to occur. But the tenants would have a right of first refusal to return to their unit. It doesn't specify the price at which they return because every owner is going to have different costs that they have to manage and deal with. But the idea is that tenants are, given preference to move back into the homes that they previously occupied. The law also gives 90 days from April 20th, that takes us to mid-July, for community boards, the 15 that are identified in the legislation, to adopt a resolution either supporting or opposing their inclusion. The city council can then include as many as 15 community boards in this program. So this is an area where CB17 could make recommendations to your local council member, pass a resolution for your local council member to include you in the legalization program that that the city council would need to adopt. That would get you a certain distance down the road, but there are still zoning challenges. Things like allowing an additional unit to be added to a single or two-family home, even if it's a two-family zoning district, or even if the zoning says that the maximum number of units allowed on a lot of this size today is 2, you would have to allow an additional unit. That is one of the changes that would be needed. Once you convert a cellar to living space, it technically gets considered floor area, and it falls under the limitations in zoning of floor area ratio and all those things that zoning regulates. You would want to make sure that zoning does not count an existing basement or cellar as new additional floor area, even if the building isn't being enlarged in any physical way. And finally, it's generally going to be impractical to add a parking space when you're adding one of these units. Not requiring the addition of a parking space is a very important condition. It was actually one of the main reasons why zoning was a big obstacle to buildings in East New York adding a basement unit. These are 3 things that are covered by the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity proposal. I know this is another very large and very broad subject that the board is reviewing currently it's in the public review process, but part of that proposal would accommodate the addition of basement apartments, either legalization of existing units that people are already living in, or the addition of new units within the limitations set forth in that zoning proposal. So together, the state legislation that was passed, a local law to implement that state legislation, and city zoning changes would enable the legalization of basement apartments. It's a lot. So what next? Next slide, please. That's great because that code and zoning changes can make it legal to make safety improvements, can give a path towards making your basement apartment lawful, and give security to people who are living in those units, that they're just like any other tenant in two or three family home. But it doesn't make it easy. And these are recommendations that we have at CHBC and our partners in the BASE Coalition. There are additional things that could make it more practical for ordinary homeowners to do this. This isn't something that's being proposed so that developers can do it. That's not the intent behind it at all. The intent is that ordinary homeowners should be able to make these kinds of changes when they can find the investment to pull together in order to modify their home. So the state budget also created an opt-in program for municipalities throughout the state to give a tax exemption for homeowners adding and what they call an accessory dwelling unit, but in this case, a basement apartment would qualify. What does that mean? It means that if you legalize or add an apartment, your property taxes normally would go up, but with a tax exemption, they would not go up for some period of time. I think it's about 10 years. In other words, that you wouldn't be paying for the privilege of adding or legalizing this unit. And we know that that could be a big impediment to people filing the permits and doing all the work that you need to do to legalize a unit. We think it's really important from our experience in East New York, where Cypress Hills LDC was the local partner, provided technical assistance for homeowners, helped them navigate the process with DOB and with other agencies. We think it's really important that there be resources available for community-based organizations to do that kind of support for homeowners. Our friends and other organizations, another partner in BASE is the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, which already provides a lot of support for homeowners. Those kinds of organizations will be a really important resource. And finally, in the East New York pilot, there was financial assistance for homeowners who couldn't afford to make improvements. We think that that's going to be important for at least some owners of existing apartments that need legalization. So these are some of the actions that we think are important and necessary in order to make it possible to make these basement apartments safe and legal. I've just spoken a lot. I hope it was informative, but I'd be really happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, right now the floor is open, so I think I see Margarita first. Just please, just real one after the other, just go ahead and please ask your questions. Thank you, Howard.
I go first?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So this is a separate program from City of Yes, right? Right, yes? There's two
Um,
separate programs, but what you're saying is sort of that one, for this program, for this pilot program to succeed, it has to partner with City of Yes? It's not really a separate program? That's my
yeah,
first question. And the
yes,
second
okay.
part of the second part of the question is, this pilot program, is it just for basement apartments or are add-ons and ADUs part of this pilot program?
Okay. Two excellent questions, and I appreciate your clarifying these because they're really important points. So the first one is what the state legislation has authorized is a city legalization program that provides relief from the multiple dwelling law. That is important when you're trying to add a unit to an existing two-family home. Without the ability to modify the multiple dwelling law, which affects three-family homes, you can't make those changes at all. So you need this state program. The city can, through changes to building code and zoning, enable you to add a unit to a single family home. That requires changes to, as I said, building code and zoning. So there are kind of three pieces. There's the state legislation, which gives the city the ability to change the state multiple dwelling law. There's changing building codes to make them flexible enough to allow legalization, which is local legislation that the city council would have to pass. And there are changes to zoning. Changes to zoning could happen separate from City of Yes, but they are included in City of Yes. So they are one piece of the much larger citywide proposal, but they are embedded in City of Yes. So the three things that are in motion today, or I should say the three things that would, of the three things that could happen, the state has passed their legislation. The city has not yet introduced the city council would introduce a local law to change building codes and modify the state multiple dwelling law. And the city would need to change zoning. City of Yes is the conversation within which that piece is happening right now. So they are overlapping is my best description of that. Does that help?
I'm not really, because I
Yeah.
guess is, can this pilot program exist without the City of Yes?
The answer is pretty much no. And it's because
Okay.
you might be able to comply with building code and the multiple dwelling law, but if you can't add a parking space, it doesn't matter. You can't comply with zoning. So you kind of have to fix all of the laws that you have to comply with. And without fixing the zoning piece of it, most buildings are not going to be able to do this. So something has to happen with the zoning in order to make this pilot program work properly. Please forgive me. In answering your first question, I forgot your second question.
Well, the second part was just that does this pilot program, is it only for about basement apartments, or are the ADUs and add-ons
Right.
also included in the pilot program?
So
Or is that just the City of Yes?
That's right. So the state legislation only covers the legalization of existing basement and cellar spaces. If you were creating a new ADU, you wouldn't be able to modify the state law to do so. So you could not go from a 2-family to a 3-family within the same building, if it's not legalizing an existing space, right? You couldn't add on to the back of your home a connected space to make it a 3-family home under the state legislation. The City of Yes component includes basements and other kinds of ADUs. So I wish I had a good diagram, and I think you're giving me an idea for a good diagram. It's like two overlapping circles, like a Venn diagram, where the state legislation covers certain things and this zoning changes cover certain things, and certain things require both of them. So additional ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and those can take different forms, would be covered by the zoning, but they are not covered by the state
Okay, all
legislation.
right. Yeah, that's clearer to me. Thank you.
Sure, and I acknowledge that these are really, the complexity of explaining this is just one piece of how complicated it is for any homeowner to try to comply with any of these rules. There are overlapping sets of regulations that make it very, very challenging.
Hi, good evening. I had a question as well. Well, actually, two. And the first one is, based on the analysis that was performed for the East New York project, was there an average cost to convert a basement apartment to a legal basement apartment? Was any study done
Yes.
about the average cost? Yeah.
And I should know it off the top of my head, and I don't have it on the tip of my tongue. I will look that up and I'll follow up. But it was exceptionally high. It was several $100,000 on average, and that cost is not the cost of making the unit safe. That's the cost of bringing it up to code. Oftentimes, what we found is that the requirements were not driven by safety concerns; they were driven by code concerns, and code requirements are there for safety and then for sort of, standards for with new buildings mostly in mind. So we think that there's an opportunity to make modifications that maintain safety, but don't make you meet all of the standards that, for instance, a new building would have to meet.
Okay.
But it was several $100,000, which is unreasonable, I think,
Right.
for the cost of adding a unit to a home. It's really got to be something that's accessible to ordinary people. You might be able to find a loan for it. You might be able to do the work yourself. It's not supposed to be a project that, only somebody who's purchasing a new home is going to be able to access. We think it's really, really important that this be a tool for homeowners to use to support themselves.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. And the next question is, I don't know if you have any insight on this, but it would be helpful. Do you know if a permit can be obtained in an event where a basement was already converted? Because obviously a lot of people are already renting out their basements and renovating their basements.
Yes.
So it sounded like you said that there was immunity, so that anybody who previously did it would not get violated or receive a violation. So with that, do you understand if there are any complexities with that or any issues with already renovated basements?
So that is the premise, and that's actually I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually written into the state legislation. It gives the city the authority to provide forgiveness for fines or violations that may have been issued on a space prior to registering for this legalization program, right? That's without that, people won't enter into the program. You need to provide people sort of safe harbor that if they are going to make the improvements, that you can sort of wipe the slate clean on fines or violations they may have had before. So it hasn't been spelled out exactly how that process is going to work, and that is something that the local law and then whatever agency, whether it's DOB or another agency, is responsible for administering it would spell out. But the intent is that, yes, whatever work has been done is not, they don't go out and issue violations. They go out and basically, I guess the idea is you create more of a punch list of the things that you have to do in order to bring the unit up to code. And then you demonstrate that you have done those things in order to, you're probably given interim legal status as long as you as long as the unit is reasonably safe to occupy, that there's no immediate hazards. That's the way that these kinds of programs have typically worked in the past. You register, they make sure that everything is, and that there's basic safety, and then you make all the improvements that are needed to bring the unit up to code, and then you are legalized on a permanent basis.
Okay, great. And final question, will these converted apartments or converted basement apartments be considered a two-family home legally? Like, can it be marketed as a two-family home?
That's a really good question, and I assume that basically whatever legal status is given the home, it may be a two-family home, it may be a single-family home with what's the zoning would call an ancillary dwelling unit, an ADU. But you can market it as whatever it is under the law. So I think that's I don't know if I can come up with a more precise answer to that, but the answer is yes. Whatever you are lawfully, your certificate of occupancy will say the way you're allowed to occupy the building, and that's how you can market the home.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Of course. Are there any other sort of maybe perhaps specific questions about safety issues? Because I know that that's a concern, and I think that was. Oh, yes.
I do have a question. It's not safety. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I am very interested in learning more because I do feel like there's some undertones that are not in the favor of the homeowners like myself that have owned property in this district for over 50 years. When I'm looking around and seeing all of the spaces that are now popping up into apartment buildings that are, I guess have met the zoning law, but I'm seeing more and more in the neighborhood, in the trenches. And I would like to know how is this happening? How are we adding these units going up, right? Like if you have a 2-family or 3-family, I've seen certain like homes that now they're building on top of the roof where they're extending it. So now instead of a 3-family, you may have a 5 floors. You understand what I'm saying? And a
Yeah.
roof. So how is this? Is this part of the city of Yes? Do you know about this? Can you tell me more about this?
I'll do my best to answer that. And part of it is that different zoning districts allow different things. And I know that CB17 has areas that are zoned R4 and R5, which are predominantly for smaller homes or apartment buildings that are not more than 3 stories. That's sort of the maximum that can be built in those districts. And often what you end up with is single and 2-family homes. Then there are other portions of the district that are zoned either R6 or R7, and those are districts that allow a wider range, and they allow multifamily homes, and they allow buildings that are taller. And existing buildings can be modified in those districts. So those are things that are allowed today. There are other provisions in the City of Yes proposal that would allow it to occur, that would allow other types of multifamily housing to be built in a broader range of conditions, but they don't, for the most part, change what's allowed in an R6 or R7 district. Generally, you can build multifamily housing in those districts.
Yeah, because I feel like it's really making it harder for the person who is retired, for the homeowner that's retired, or the homeowner that is struggling because the tenant is not paying the rent. And now I'm hearing and seeing people just move in communities, 17 we're talking about, and building and charging rent where people cannot live. And you have the mom and pop homeowners, I'm just going to phrase it like that, working people to put all their money and resources into their homes. And here comes people talking about what they can't and cannot do. So I'm feeling like there's some regulation. I'm trying to be politically correct, but it doesn't feel right. You understand what I'm saying? I feel like I'm being harassed in a sense, because now I'm looking all around my neighborhood. I don't even recognize it, because whoever's getting the okay to build up. They're building up, and they're charging
Right.
astronomical fees for rent. But yet you're telling, or what I'm hearing, not you. Please don't.
No,
I'm
I understand.
hearing
That's okay.
that the homeowners in my district who deserve to have a residual income, especially if they're looking at retirement. I mean, let's look at what it is and make it make sense for everybody. Because I'm real uncomfortable when I walk out and I see people that don't live in my neighborhood making millions off of the space that we have, right? But at the same time, the incentives are not given to me. No one has said a thing about
Right.
what's going on.
So I think let me say this, because I think I am understanding what you're saying a little bit better. And you might have a block where on one street frontage, usually like the short end of the block, it's zoned for a higher density, or like on one side of the street it's zoned for a higher density, and people can build apartment buildings, and you're seeing that kind of activity. And then the rest of the neighborhood that might be zoned R4 or R5, you have small homes. And if you wanted to do any of the things that I just described in this presentation, you wanted to, my favorite example is this: like, you have a family, like 2 adults, some kids living in a house, and they decide that they're going to separate or get divorced. The same people can't split that house in half and split it into 2 units with the same exact people living in it. They're not allowed to do that unless you add a parking space, unless you make all sorts of other modifications to the home. And that is, I think, just like one version of what you're talking about, which is people are living in a house and they just want to change it to do the thing that works for them. And somehow the regulations are much more stringent for those districts that are focused on small homes than they are for the districts that allow multifamily housing, where people who are building can build much more flexibly. And I think that's one of the issues that, or at least that's my version of the story you're telling, I think. Which
it's
is
a
that,
very good version. It is a very good version, but to be honest with you, it really says to me that it's almost like, I don't know, discriminatory in a way, because we're targeting
Right.
certain areas for this. And you spoke about it earlier, or it was spoken earlier, like, my community is, you can see the demographics, and this is who we're representing. And if I don't have, or if I can't be the voice of people, hardworking people that I know own these homes, then, then I don't understand. Is the mindset at the end, 20 years from now, they're going to take over everybody's home, and you won't have, because they're making it so impossible for you, like you mentioned, to do some of the repairs or to make the changes. Who has that kind of money? And I would just be curious. I hope that we get preference to, some type of grant or incentive to support people that may want to do that, make a change.
Thank you. I think David had a question, a comment. David, do you still have a question, a comment?
If David, I already,
You did.
yeah.
Okay, has, okay. So I think Valerie was next and then Margarita. Marguerite?
Oh, it's me again?
Valerie Booth.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like Mr. Can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah. The general feeling that people who live in these, I guess the 1 to 5
Mhm.
districts have, and legitimately, is that they're being put upon and discriminated against and being forced to accept a different style of living. I understand about people who need to, they might need to rent their basement or find a way to, to rent their space, their, extra space to make, extra money. I understand that. But most people have spent their hard-earned money on these houses. They'd like to, the flavor of the communities is important. That middle class, low density flavor that most people have come to enjoy. That's why they bought into these areas 40, 50 years ago. And now you're telling them that's done, that's over. You have to now live in a high density area with a high rise building with four, five, six different colors on the outside, the mailboxes on the outside, and all kinds of other, minor atrocities. And so the lifestyle, the feel is not the same. So what does that do? It doesn't do much. It doesn't do a lot for your psyche. It doesn't do a lot for your feeling of, your level of comfort in how you live. You just want to pack up and move someplace else. What does it do to the property value?
Mhm.
It's, so you're basically taking a swath of the city and saying you no longer count. And to be honest, I don't even know these new apartment buildings, who they're going to be renting to, who are they for? Because I know a lot of the migrants that are coming in, they don't have jobs. They certainly are not making this $108,000 AMI that's supposed to be at the very bottom of the barrel, So what exactly is the whole purpose of this? Where are the
So
we're all getting kicked to the curb one way or another.
let me do my best to respond to some of the issues that you described. I think there are a lot of things out there to comment on and to respond to, and it's everything from what dramatic changes that would increase the density to allow like tall buildings to be built in low density neighborhoods, which is not something that tall buildings are not something that are proposed in any of the proposals that I'm aware of. But there's a range of. Let me start with this. We started our research at CHPC because we didn't want to jump immediately to what the solutions were. We wanted to understand what the problem was that we were trying to deal with, and the problem that we found was that after decades of not adding housing in these neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods existing in a system, in a city where there are people moving around all the time, and where there's a lot of population growth and pressure and change and demographic change that's happening all the time in neighborhoods, that what's happening is housing is getting so expensive that single family homes that might have been within reach of a middle class family 30, 40 years ago are no longer something that a typical middle class family can afford today. And that the range of options that are available for people, particularly in low density districts, and I say that very broadly, R1 through R5, it covers a lot of, it covers 71% of the city's residential area, but it's a wide range of neighborhoods. But the kind of housing that's available in those neighborhoods often doesn't include smaller or lower cost choices. And so people end up in living arrangements that don't necessarily work for them. Owners can't do things like get the supplemental income they think they feel like they need in order to support the cost of maintaining their home, or perhaps the cost of their retirement if they're relying on income for their retirement. There are all those challenges that exist within the amount of housing that we have today. So what are the ways to add housing? I don't think, I think that you as a community board are here to, and now I'm talking more about everything that that you've raised that's related to the city of Yes and not just basements. But there are lots of different ways to add housing. It could be building high rises in a low rise neighborhood. That's one extreme. The other sort of extreme would be to take existing buildings and reuse them in different configurations. And that doesn't make buildings larger. It doesn't, it keeps the physical form of the neighborhood largely as it is today, and it lets people use the buildings in a different way. There's a lot in between those, and I think there are a lot of important options to be considered. And I think that it's, you as community members, you as participants in the community board, That's what I'm not going to tell you what you think. You're going to tell me, you're going to tell the city, you're going to tell other people what you think. But I think the important thing is that without some additional options, we are really in a position where we don't see any way for things to get easier for homeowners or for people who are in need of housing in lower density neighborhoods. And as I said, just ordinary middle class people or seniors who are renting today and will need a place to live, 5 years from now. Like these are all people who need something.
Thank you, Alexandra, then Vanessa, then Margaret.
Hi, how are you? I really just have a statement. If we bring more housing into Brooklyn, however that happens, what Brooklyn really needs is more resources for the DHCR office. I believe I have evidence and experience that landlords are taking advantage of tenants in the existing housing, and this affects the housing market, and it's going to affect the future market once all of these new units are built. I can't stress the importance of this enough. We need to make sure that the existing tenants are being treated fairly. The new tenants who are going into these new buildings are being treated fairly. They're being charged fairly. That tenants have, resources. I currently have reports in with DHCR, and it's been almost 2 years since I've opened multiple cases, and there's just no one to service. And I think the market rate for rent is artificially inflated. I think that's very dangerous for our economy. And we need to get the existing landlords who are doing all of this building in check.
Thank
One thing
you.
I'd say in response to that, and I can say I appreciate all the points you made, and there are lots of laws and regulations, and everyone should be following them, and that's a really important thing. I think the one thing that I would add to that is that when there isn't enough housing, and tenants and people who are looking for housing are squeezed and don't have many choices, that puts more power in the hands of landlords to act as they please, because tenants don't have a lot of alternatives, and tenants are worried about what other choices they have. So I think the two things, that what you mentioned and the idea of adding more housing are two ideas that work well together, in the sense that in an environment with not enough housing, it's really, really difficult to chase down all of the bad actors, and they are empowered in lots of ways.
I do agree with that. I'm going to give you one specific example that probably would not change without any additional DHCR regulations or staffing. Currently, as a tenant, if you are looking at moving into a rent stabilized unit, you cannot request the history of that unit to make sure that you're being charged fairly before you sign a lease. So that's one big problem. Yes, you can file something in response to that after you move in and after you receive your lease, but then comes the problem where DHCR takes a year or 2 years or more to address your case, their cases. So I agree with you. Having a shortage of housing gives the landlords that upper hand, but there are still too many other loopholes that they are able to use to get money illegally out of tenants.
I have a sort of a half-informed thing to add to that, and you may know more than I do about this at this point. There was an online search tool that HCR made available some months ago, and I think it was promoted on TikTok, and then the system crashed. But are you saying that you can't search that before you rent a unit, or maybe there's not enough time and HCR can't turn around your request in enough time? That's something that is potentially an interesting problem, but maybe a solvable one. I'm going to take that note home with me.
Okay. Yeah, I think you can search which buildings are rent stabilized, but you cannot request the rent history. specific unit.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I
Thank-
thought there was a way to do it, but if I find that there is, I will reach back out to JLs to share that information. Thank you.
Thanks for that observation. Vanessa and then Marguerite.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for the presentation. I have a concern for the older homeowners with the basements and having the availability for tenants to move in
Mhm.
and the different types of people who want to move in. There are different legislations coming on that weren't there before on screening these tenants. And we have, now we're saying we have a lot of homeless people and we have a lot of new types of people coming into New York that we didn't have before. And I see that we, as homeowners, are at a crossroad because we're going to be vulnerable. We don't know who we're letting in our homes. These are our homes. So now we renovate our basement, we make them legal, and now we're at a crux where we're not getting really the market value for it because you got to pay back that loan. And now you have somebody who may not really be sane, right in their mind, and now we have to deal with that. And no one in the city is going to help you at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And
I think that's
so,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
and that's going to be a huge problem for somebody that's over 60.
Mhm.
And that's mostly the homeowners that you see in these 1-2 family homes who work very hard in this community, that got their home and is trying to enjoy their retirement. This wasn't the vision that we had in this community. And now you're seeing a lot of shelters being built over here. And you're seeing a lot of new people in the parks with their children that are in these shelters. And it's not what we expected. And they're not moving into those new developments because they can't afford it. But they can afford our homes because we can only charge but so much. And that's what I'm afraid of. The crime rate is going to increase and we're going to have them in our homes. And that's something where we're looking a devil in the face by making affordable homes and having the devil living with us. That's all I want to say. That's
Can I
something we need to research. Go ahead, sure.
Can I ask a question because I want to understand what you're saying?
Sure.
I think it's an excellent point. This is something I've thought about myself, and not just for my job, but also because in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, I have a lot of neighbors who are seniors who are, the houses that were built originally as 3-story houses, and there's one person or two people living in them. They have a lot of space. They don't use an entire floor of their house. They can barely take care of it. It would be great if they had a tenant, but the biggest obstacle is, can they screen tenants for someone that they feel comfortable sharing their home with? Can they, have someone who can, maybe with that rent, they can have someone who helps them take care of the building and the space, right? So they don't have to do all the work of maintaining the unit for the tenant. But there's a lot of work that's associated with that. And that seems like a really, really great area for assistance to homeowners who are interested in sort of getting that retirement income or something else, because it's not the same as just renting. It's not the same as being a rental property owner. You're sharing your home with someone's living downstairs from you in your building. It's a very different kind of relationship. So I think, to me, that raises the question of, do you think there are more resources necessary for people to be able to do that safely? Or is it sort of a concern just that more people in the neighborhood are going to, potentially bring in an influence that you're not interested in?
They're going to bring an influence that we're not interested in. And it's already happening. It's already happening right now.
Understood. Thank you.
Based with the mayor just implemented not too long ago with the voucher program.
Hmm.
It used to be with Section 8, it was volunteer. If you wanted to be in the Section 8 program as a homeowner, you applied for it. Now with the voucher program, everyone has to take vouchers. So it's against the law if you don't take vouchers.
Mm-hmm.
It's considered cash.
Got it. I'm just taking notes. I'm looking down so I can take my notes home with me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, then Tamara. Okay, Tamara, if you're ready, Marguerite. Tamara.
Oh, I was ready. I thought Marguerite was going first.
Yeah, but she didn't respond, so go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you for your presentation. What I'm wondering is how I thought I heard you say that part of the proposal would be for the city to not increase property taxes on those conversions, right? Adding an additional units. This city is extremely cash starved right now because of the choices that they've made. I'm just curious how you believe that the city is going to pass up the potential for additional revenue. It just sounds extremely idealistic, not for nothing.
Understood. Here's what
Yeah,
so
because I'm wondering how you're going to sell this to them so that they don't.
sure. You know, the city does a lot of things already. Well, there's two things. One is that and property tax burdens are New York City's property tax system is deeply inequitable and unfair from neighborhood to neighborhood and also from one class of property owner to another. And there are a lot of issues in that. And a lot of times making changes to the property tax system is kind of like putting a Band-Aid on something that maybe requires some bigger fixes. But the bigger fixes have been elusive for a long time. So there are a lot of Band-Aid kind of fixes. So, you know, if you have people who have apartments that are illegal and need to be brought up to code, but and legalized, and we want them to legalize them. You know, we want them to be safe and legal. Then taxing them for doing that is going to be a strong disincentive for them to actually enter into that program. So there's an optional program for creating a new unit, a new legal apartment. You would not pay property taxes on that new unit for a period of time. So it's not that your property taxes would go down or that you would stop paying the taxes you were paying before, but it's that they wouldn't go up as a result of your adding the new apartment, at least for a period of time. Okay.
Well, no, yeah, I
so
understood that.
It's a technique that the city uses, the city provides, and it's a tool to reduce property tax burdens so that new housing gets created. It's one that the city hasn't done yet. It could do that under the state law that was passed. It's an opt-in program, so the city council would have to vote to authorize that that program.
Thank you. Marguerite, do you still have a question?
Yeah, well, kind of more of a statement, but you know, these programs, all of this always seems to me like kind of I don't want to use the word sneaky, but I'm going to use the word sneaky. A sneaky way to get more density into low density communities. We don't really want that density. Now that's like we're being NIMBY, whatever you want to call it. But the reason we live in these areas is because it's low density. So all of this is adding density, which we really don't want. And you're making the assumption that a person that lives in an older person that lives in a large house wants other people living there with them. They don't necessarily. And it feels like, oh, so then they're going to be penalized because like they should have a tenant. they should deal with all this extra stress of having a tenant, having to evict somebody. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Also, you're adding density. Then when we never talk about infrastructure and bringing more people and having more people next to you in small homes. I own a home. I have an attached home. And the man next door sold his home. The person that bought it rents it, and he split the home. So it's a 3-bedroom home with a basement. He split the house into, he's renting it to 7 people. This is illegal, but nobody's doing anything about it. He's already doing that without any, code changes, without anything different, without new programs. So this is just going to add. It's going to add to so much chaos in our small neighborhoods where we don't want any more people. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. If I can, I'd like to try to respond to a couple different things you said. One is, we like our neighborhood the way it is. We don't want more people. That's a very, but.
Yeah, I didn't hear that. You got cut off.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. It's a very common feeling that I like this. I moved to this neighborhood. I like it the way it is. I would like it to stay that way. As a city, if we didn't produce any more housing in any of these neighborhoods, we would become even more unaffordable and exclusionary than we are already as a city. We would have an even larger homelessness problem. We would have an even larger housing affordability program. It would work reasonably well for people who already have housing, but work really terribly for people who don't. And that is a big concern for the city, and it only becomes more serious over time. So the question, I think, and the question I would pose is, well, I moved to this neighborhood because I like the way this neighborhood feels. What kind of additional housing options would fit in within that neighborhood? It's not some things that some people have mentioned. You don't want to see high-rise buildings in the middle of your low-rise neighborhood. That, I'm not trying to put words in anyone's mouth, but that's one possible response. Are there ways that you could reuse the kinds of buildings that exist to accommodate different kinds of households? It doesn't necessarily even amount to more people to allow more different types of units, because people are often living in crowded situations or with unrelated adults, living as boarders, but allowing them to live in a separate unit within the same building might be an improvement for them. And I want to add also, there's nothing that I'm aware of. There's nothing in any of the proposals I've heard. There's certainly nothing in the basement legalization legislation that says that anyone has to do this. If you're a homeowner and you don't want to do this, don't do it. It is not required. It is not even necessarily encouraged. It's just an option, and it's something that really I think it's really. I try to approach these issues at CHPC from the perspective of how can people make their homes work for them and their needs, and I think that's an important question to keep asking, and what that amounts to as a city. I think the question that's being raised as part of the City of Yes conversation is, well, if no one wants to have any more housing, what are we going to say to our children and to our children's children about why they can't afford to live in New York City and why they're moving out, and my community is all moving out of state because we can't find any place that we can afford to live. We're trying to solve for that in ways that are compatible with neighborhood needs and desires, and there's going to be a lot of different perspectives on that. And I hope, I hope you all are. I find this conversation in this meeting. I don't meet with community boards that often anymore. I used to meet with them all the time, and I always find community board meetings really encouraging when people are this engaged in the future of their neighborhoods. And I think by getting your voices into the conversation and trying to find solutions that are going to reflect your perspectives, we can get to better solutions. That's my belief.
Thank you. I have one other comment or question from Fatima, and then because I think we need to take an action item, we need to have an action item thanks to Howard, we realized we need to take a vote tonight for a resolution. So after this, then we'll wrap up. So Fatima, please.
Oh, yes, hello, good evening. My only question was, like, these basement apartments, it's not mandatory for the people who own the houses to build them, correct?
That's correct. It's not required for anyone to build them, though. If you have a unit that has a building that has an illegal basement apartment in it, at some point in the future, you may be obligated to do something with it, which is either make it lawful or eliminate it. And having the option of making it lawful, I think, would be the new thing and the important addition.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David.
When Marguerite was speaking, I heard her say something that I'm not sure you addressed, and so I'm hoping that you could shed some light on, like, from the perspective of a housing professional, right? Because your job is in strategy and planning as it relates to housing. Can you talk at all about the infrastructure issues that get caused when a low density neighborhood goes to a higher density neighborhood? There's things like sewage, there's things like trash pickup, there's all kinds of infrastructure that is gonna be pushed, right? Are you able to talk about that at all?
Sure. I can tell you what I can tell about that, and I think those are the kind of issues that occur most often and most pronounced in the most pronounced way when you see, a neighborhood that, let's say, an R4 neighborhood is rezoned to an R8, and you see a lot of high density development occur in a concentrated area. That's when you start to see things like local infrastructure impacts. That, or in an area that has some sort of existing infrastructure problem, those are questions that need to be looked at. So for instance, if your school is already over capacity, you have questions, and those are legitimate questions that are important to take up in the SCA planning process or whatever agency capital planning process exists. The nature of the changes when they're sort of a unit here, a unit there, a limited number of units sort of sprinkled over a larger area, are more diffuse in their infrastructure impacts. I won't say that categorically means that they have no significance whatsoever, but it means that they generally have a lot less impact on local infrastructure than when you are doing something that's more concentrated. And I know that it is something that, at least in one way or another, the city of Yes, which includes a lot more than just the basement issue that we were focusing on this evening, that environmental review document, I'm sure it's a very, I know it's a very thick and probably a very unfun document to read. Environmental review documents are notoriously difficult, but it's supposed to be looking at those issues in a categorical way, right? Like, what kinds of infrastructure issues need to have more attention? I think there are interesting questions. I think that, for instance, basement apartments and stormwater management. Stormwater management is a very important consideration when legalizing or creating a new basement apartment, and that there need to be certain best practices, certain standards that you adhere to when you are creating those units, and that there may be areas in which those units shouldn't be created or shouldn't be permanently legalized. And those are important questions that need to be addressed in the process as well. But I think overall, the nature of, modest changes spread, I say modest, but they're not sort of enormous densification. When you spread it over a larger area, it tends to have less of an impact on neighborhood infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Howard. Specifically for two things in addition to everything else. You brought to our attention the fact that under this legislation, we need to the board needs to vote on this. And secondly, you just said something very important. You talked about the fact that this approach offers a less concentrated way of dealing with the housing crisis. So we as a community 17, if you haven't gone down Martins Avenue in a long time, I encourage you to do it. Because what is happening in our community is that homes are being destroyed. because of the lack of zoning protection other districts have. And then where you had, for example, 3 homes before, you now have a high rise with 300 people, right? The city has said there's a housing crisis, and it is justifying the destruction of homes on the basis of this housing crisis. So what the pilot program offers is a way to explore dealing with this housing crisis to mitigate the need or the perceived need to destroy homes by providing additional homes in a less concentrated area. And so because of that, we need to take this to the board to vote on. So I'm going to ask for a motion. It is not that we are saying we're in favor of it, but we need to bring it to the board for a discussion. So the motion on the floor, which would be needed, would be to present the proposal to be part of the pilot program, to present it to the board for discussion. Can I get a motion from the floor? Can I get a motion from the floor? Tamara. All right.
Yes. So yes, I'd like to make the motion. Reword it again. Say it again. What's the motion? Bring it to the board to decide. Tamara Thomas makes the motion to bring this discussion to the board.
Is there someone else? Is there a second?
I second this motion, David Boatswain.
Thank you. Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed to bring it to the board? Okay, great. So I really want to thank Howard for this presentation tonight. It was very enlightening. And we as a community, because what is not being said is that other communities the reason why we have this housing crisis is because there was a concerted effort to protect the wealth of other neighborhoods. Because let's face it, homes represent wealth, okay? For many Black folks especially, if they didn't have homes, they would have very little assets. So other neighborhoods were able to protect it. And when their children need places to live, they can't find any place to live. So then they need to move into CB 17. And then the result is displacement. If Long Island, if Staten Island would take responsibility for providing housing for their own children, we're not asking them to house immigrants. We're not asking them to provide housing for your children. And that's what's not happening because of the protectionism there. So then we are feeling it the most because we're the most vulnerable. So I hope this discussion tonight was very informative. We need to wrap up. Tamara, do you have a quick question and a quick comment before we end? And Marguerite as well. Otherwise, okay, Marguerite, a quick comment, and we'll end on that note. I thank all of them.
My comment is always that there isn't really a housing crisis. There's enough housing. The fact is that there's not enough affordable housing, and everything we do is not going to produce affordable housing because you have greedy landlords, and you're still not going to have enough housing. It's not that there's a housing crisis, it's an affordability crisis. That's
absolutely. I mean, in support of that, many of the apartment buildings which have been constructed in a neighborhood, they're not fully utilized, right? But it's a way of warehousing those buildings for the future. But in the meantime, people are being displaced to construct these buildings. So, I mean, it does appear, I would just say that this approach may help us to preserve many homes in our district. And, we have the statistics to show the number of units that can be created from doing this.
I do want to add just one thing, which is that there is genuinely a shortage of housing, and that there's an extraordinarily a record low vacancy rate in New York City, of 1.4%, vacancy rate in the housing stock. It's lower than it's been on record, at least for the last 30 years. So there's not a there are definitely ways that we could make better use of our housing, but there is definitely also not enough of it. I mean, and I say that as a housing professional who's been working in this field for decades. It's only gotten worse since I started working, so maybe I haven't been doing such a great job. But there's genuinely, I think, a real need, and there's certainly most pronounced need for more affordable housing. I don't want to contest that at all.
Thank you. So on that end, I will ask for motion. I will once again want to thank you, Howard. This was extremely enlightening, and we really appreciate you taking the time off to speak. We hope you had a good time doing this.
I just want to thank you all for putting so much time in on behalf of your community. It's really important, and I'm so glad that you're all doing it. And I thank you for inviting me, and I hope this was a helpful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. On that note, can I get a motion to adjourn the meeting at 9:25?
I make a motion to adjourn the meeting, Marguerite.
Vanessa Cross, she seconds it.
Thank you. Have a very good evening, and please attend the board meeting, which is scheduled for not this Wednesday, but the following Wednesday. Come out and express your voices, express your concerns, because this is something that is going to impact us greatly. Thank you very much.
Sorry, wait. It's June 18th. It's on a Tuesday because the 19th
Yes.
is Juneteenth.
Thank you
it's
so
actually
much.
Tuesday. Yeah.
Please put in your calendars that the board's meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, right? Tuesday, June 18th, because the normal night, the 19th, is a holiday.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care. Have a very great evening.
Thank you all.
Good night,
This is
everyone.
TK Price. I just wanted to
Thanks.
check in.
Bye.
Good night. Good night.